Good day. It's becoming increasingly clear that we are in a very high stakes game of poker between the United States and NATO on the one side and Russia on the other, on the two topics of Ukraine and the conflict there, and on the related topic of NATO's expansion eastward, which the Russians have now made clear that they want to see ended. And there has now been an announcement, a statement by the Russian Foreign Ministry, which is released on the Russian Foreign Ministry website on Friday, in Russian, and of which we now have a translation, and which sets out what the Russian demands, and they are now demands, what those demands are. And I will read it as follows, because it's quite useful, as it gives a useful summary of the Russian position at the moment. And it reads as follows. We note US President Joseph Biden's readiness expressed at the December 7th talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin to establish a serious dialogue on issues related to ensuring the security of the Russian Federation. Such a dialogue is urgently needed today when the relations between Russia and the collective West continue to decay and have approached a critical line. At the same time, numerous loose interpretations of our position have emerged in recent days. In this connection, we feel it is necessary to once again clarify the following. Escalating a confrontation with our country is absolutely unacceptable. As a pretext, the West is using the situation in Ukraine, where it embarked on encouraging Russophobia and justifying the actions of the Kiev regime to undermine the Minsk agreements and prepare for a military scenario in Donbass. Instead of reining in their Ukrainian protégés, NATO countries are pushing Kiev towards aggressive steps. There can be no alternative interpretation of the increasing number of unplanned exercises by the United States and its allies in the Black Sea. NATO members' aircraft, including strategic bombers, regularly make provocative flights and dangerous maneuvers in close proximity to Russia's borders. The militarization of Ukraine's territory and pumping it with weapons are ongoing. The course has been chosen of drawing Ukraine into NATO, which is fraught with the deployment of strike missile systems there, with minimal flight time to central Russia and other destabilizing weapons. Such irresponsible behavior creates grave military risks for all parties involved, up to and including a large-scale conflict in Europe. At the same time, statements are made that the issue of Ukraine's hypothetical NATO membership concerns exclusively Kiev and the alliance, and that nobody should interfere in this process. Let us recall, however, that NATO countries, apart from the Washington Treaty, have obligations regarding the indivisible security in the Euro-Atlantic and the entire OSCE space. The principle was initially proclaimed in the Helsinki Final Act and was later reaffirmed in the Charter of Paris for a New Europe of 1990, which states security is indivisible and the security of every participating state is inseparably linked to that of all the others. Whereas in 1999, the Charter for European Security was adopted at the OSCE Istanbul Summit, which stressed that the participating states will not strengthen their security at the expense of the security of other states. All these documents were signed by the leaders of the OSCE member states, including all NATO countries. However, in violation of the principle of indivisible security as well as in violation of promises given to Soviet leaders, NATO has been persistently moving eastwards all these years, whilst neglecting Moscow's concerns. Furthermore, each new member added to NATO's frenzied anti-Russian charge. We have been saying for a long time that such developments are inadmissible. Over the past decades, we have offered a number of times to render the principle of comprehensive and indivisible security in the Euro-Atlantic a legally binding status, since the West is obviously inclined to disregard its political obligations. However, we were invariably refused. In this connection, as President Vladimir Putin stressed, we insist that serious long-term legal guarantees are provided, which would exclude NATO's further advancement to the east and deployment of weapons on Russia's western borders, which are a threat to Russia. This must be done within a specific time frame and on the basis of the principle of comprehensive and indivisible security. To ensure the vital interests of European security, it is necessary to officially disavow the decision taken at the 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest about Ukraine and Georgia becoming NATO members, as contrary to the commitment undertaken by all the OSCE participating states not to strengthen their security at the expense of the security of other states. We insist on the adoption of a legally binding agreement regarding the United States and other NATO members' countries' non-deployment of strike weapon systems which threaten the territory of the Russian Federation on the territories of adjacent countries, both members and non-members of NATO. We also insist on receiving a concrete response from NATO to our previous proposals on decreasing tension in Europe, including the following points. 1. Withdrawal of regions for operative military exercises to an agreed distance from Russia-NATO contact line. 2. Coordination of the closest approach point of combat ships and aircraft to prevent dangerous military activities, primarily in the Baltic and Black Sea regions. 3. Renewal of regular dialogue between the defense ministries in the Russia-US and Russia-NATO formats. We call on Washington to join Russia's unilateral moratorium on the deployment of surface, short and intermediate range missiles in Europe, to agree on and introduce measures for the verification of reciprocal obligations. Russia will shortly present draft international legal documents in the indicated areas to launch talks in respective formats. In particular, we will submit a comprehensive proposal on legal security guarantees as part of preparations for the next round of the Russia-US dialogue on strategic stability. We will advocate holding an in-depth discussion of the military aspects of ensuring security via defense ministries with the engagement of the foreign ministries of Russia and NATO countries. We believe that the OSCE, which includes all countries of the Euro-Atlantic region, should not stay on the sidelines of discussions on addressing the issues of European security. We urge our partners to carefully examine Russia's proposals and start serious talks on agreements that will provide a fair and sustainable balance of interests in our common space. Now, just to pass some of this very carefully, first of all, note the overall demands. First, the NATO must disavow any intention that Ukraine and Georgia, and presumably Moldova too, though it's not mentioned here, should ever join NATO in future. The promise given to Ukraine and Georgia in 2008 that they join NATO must be specifically and expressly disavowed. Secondly, there must be a binding agreement that there will be no further eastward expansion of NATO towards Russia. Third, there must be legally binding agreements calling for the withdrawal of NATO forces and equipment from Russia's borders, from a certain distance from Russia's borders, and a legally binding agreement that there should be no exercises, no military exercises or deployments or maneuvers within a certain distance of Russia's borders. That would include, of course, the Black Sea, the Baltic Sea, Poland, the Baltic states, Bulgaria, Romania, and all the rest. Now, note also the repeated use of the words insist. The Russians insist on this. In other words, they are not going to negotiate about this. They're not flexible about these demands. They insist upon them. But last but not least, note further the fact that they are demanding that there should be a response from NATO, from the United States, agreeing to all of this within a specific time frame. And the words are as follows: this must be done within a specific time frame and on the basis of the principle of comprehensive and indivisible security. And last but not least, the Russians are saying, and it seems to me they're making a compelling point, that all of their demands are fully founded upon international law. The United States and the NATO powers made all sorts of commitments, not just verbal commitments, but actual treaty commitments to respect the indivisible security of all member states in the European area. And that, of course, includes Russia. And they've not honoured those commitments. And that is a legal binding commitment upon them, one set out in international law. And that these demands upon which the Russians are insisting are demands which seek to make effective the obligations that the West, that the collective West, that the United States and NATO made in all those previous treaties, the treaties which in effect were concluded at the end of the Cold War. But it is that word insist and the reference to a specific time frame which stands out for me. Can I just say that at an earlier comment on one of the threads to one of my videos on this, when I was talking about the fact that that the Russians have now said that NATO's eastward expansion is a red line, I said that the commenter made the point that the Russians were first giving a warning, then they would be making a demand, and if that demand wasn't met, they would eventually move on to make an ultimatum. And we see the perspicacity of that comment. Firstly, we had the Russian warning made in the summer that Russia regards the eastward expansion of NATO to include Ukraine and the deployment of US systems, military systems, NATO military systems in Ukraine as a red line. That is a warning. Now we have progressed to the demand. We insist that NATO cancel the commitment to make Ukraine and Georgia part of NATO, that promise that they will one day become part of NATO. We insist that they move their forces away from our borders. We insist that there be a legal framework encapsulating all of this. But we also now have the hint of the ultimatum to come. This must be done within a specific time frame and on the basis of the principle of comprehensive and indivisible security. Talk of a specific time frame hints at a future ultimatum. And of course, the Russians are now making direct parallels between this situation, the situation we are now in, and the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when the United States gave an ultimatum to the Soviet Union to remove its nuclear missiles from Cuba, and the Soviet Union, after negotiating, it must be said, some offsets from the United States, complied. The Russians are hinting that we're in a reverse Cuban Missile Crisis, and before very long, they will act to make those demands that they are currently insisting upon. They will act to make them effective. Now, this statement, this very powerful statement, should be read, I think, in conjunction with an earlier statement published by the Russian Foreign Ministry on the 30th of November, which sets out various issues that exist between Russia and NATO, but which also set out Russian views of NATO and why the Russians will not accept any assurances from Western governments, from the United States, from NATO itself, that NATO is a defensive alliance. The Russians have already addressed these issues in their previous statement, and they've already made it very clear why, for them, they don't accept that NATO is any form of defensive alliance or a peaceful alliance or a force for stability, and why they see its expansion eastward and Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO as an existential threat to themselves. And this is what that earlier statement of the 30th of November said about this. And it reads as follows. Myth. NATO is a defensive alliance and its expansion does not threaten Russia. Rebuttal. All of NATO's collective defence is concentrated on the eastern flank. The alliance apparently has no more problems to deal with. Terrorism and security threats coming from other regions are apparently not as important as the danger allegedly emanating from Russia. The unchecked expansion of the alliance and the engulfing of new territories go hand in hand with the deployment of military infrastructure there, which is used for military support of NATO's confrontational rhetoric and can potentially be used, among other things, to speed up the delivery of heavy military equipment and troops to the border of our country. Training grounds and storage facilities for pre-positioning heavy military equipment are being built in Eastern European member states. Opportunities are created for a foreign military presence on the territories of these states, which effectively balances on the brink of violating, if not the letter, then the spirit of the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act. NATO members engage in nuclear sharing, which runs counter to the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty provisions. More than 200 US and NATO military facilities are deployed in Europe, many of them in Central and Eastern Europe, the Baltic region and the Black Sea region. The Baltic countries are next in line. At the same time, NATO denies Russia the right to take action to ensure its national security, even on its own territory. All this cannot but cause our concern and inevitably triggers adequate defence responses on our part. NATO expansion is fueling tensions. NATO accuses Russia of military activity in the contact areas, but these areas formed precisely in the wake of NATO expansion. And then the 30th of November Russian Foreign Ministry statement goes on to say the following: myth. Russia is provoking an escalation on the situation on the border with Ukraine. Rebuttal. Russia's actions are of a purely defensive nature. Recently, we have witnessed a major increase in NATO's military presence in the Black Sea region. Warships with missiles on board enter it increasingly often, and US strategic aircraft have been flying over more frequently. Large-scale exercises, including SNAP exercises, are being conducted in the area. Almost every week, our data recorders track over 50 reconnaissance aircraft and drones cruising along our borders. NATO is purposefully putting us to the test by sending warships and aircraft into areas in the immediate vicinity of our borders, thus forcing Russia to respond. That said, our response is appropriate, proportionate, and restrained. The alliance is accusing us of building up our military presence in Ukraine, meaning the Republic of Crimea. As a reminder, this territory is part of the Russian Federation, and our armed forces are stationed there legally. Throughout history, in addition to the Black Sea Fleet, Marines, coastal defence, and other land components, as well as aviation, have been stationed in Crimea. And then, further point, myth. NATO's presence enhances regional security. Rebuttal. This is an illusion. The consequences of the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia and the destruction of Libya's statehood come to mind. Afghanistan is the most recent example. The 20-year presence of NATO contingents in Afghanistan and their subsequent hasty flight failed to achieve any of their goals. The situation has only got worse. Today, the alliance is again trying to go beyond the limits of its traditional area of responsibility and to extend its vision of the world order to new regions. To do so, it engages its partners in order to fulfill these goals. NATO has always been offering to be friends against someone. So a new wave of geographic expansion of NATO interests in the Asia-Pacific region is of an openly confrontational nature. The alliance is trying to turn this part of the world, which is a space of cooperation, into an area of geopolitical competition, declaring cyberspace and outer space NATO's operational domain, including under Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, undermines international efforts to create legally binding mechanisms for preventing the use of these areas for military purposes. So, there you have the Russian view. NATO is an aggressive alliance. It is directly threatens Russia. Its entire purpose in Europe is to threaten Russia. It is using countries with every single country. It absorbs, it increases its threat to Russia, amassing infrastructure and troops in these countries, contrary to earlier obligations assumed by the United States and by NATO that it would not do that. It has turned Ukraine into an area of conflict, And far from being a source of stability around the world, it is a source of instability, including in places like Afghanistan and Libya, where it intervened directly, though these were far outside its area. And of course, it is now meddling in the Asia-Pacific region as the United States tries to involve it in its contest with China. So the Russians have made it absolutely clear that as far as they're concerned, eastward expansion of NATO is for them a red line, and that red line is non-negotiable. And on their other demands, their demands that NATO forces be withdrawn from their borders, be removed further westward, that there should be no further NATO exercises or drills in places like the Black Sea, the Baltic Sea, and whatever. They say that these exercises are contrary to international law because they contradict the treaties agreed between the Soviet Union and the West at the end of the Cold War. And they insist that all this stop. And if that demand, which it is not met, they hint in that other statement, that later statement which I read, they hint that at some point they will issue an ultimatum requiring that all that stop within a set time frame. So this is an extremely strong position, apparently an uncompromising one, and I think that the Russians are completely serious about this. And they've shrugged off the threat of sanctions. They're not impressed by that threat of sanctions. They clearly believe they can ride out the sanctions, and besides, they're hardly likely to be deterred by threats of sanctions from taking steps which they consider essential to safeguard their red lines, which they have made clear are essential for their own security. Now, I think that these comments, these statements from Russia are beginning to cause genuine alarm and astonishment in the West. The United States and the West, up to now, has been in the habit of making demands of other countries. They've only very recently experienced a situation where other countries make demands of them. China, for example, having increasingly begun doing so. But the Russians doing it, and doing it in this way, is, I suspect, a profound shock. And some Western leaders are beginning to become increasingly alarmed. There was a very interesting press conference in Germany between the French President Emmanuel Macron and the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. And it's fairly clear that Macron in particular is beginning to become increasingly concerned that the situation that is becoming very serious, and is beginning to recognize that the Russians, in making these demands, are acting with deadly seriousness. I will read the account of what happened at this press conference from the Daily Telegraph. President Emmanuel Macron of France warned on Friday that US predictions that Russia is about to invade Ukraine could become self-fulfilling. I think that our primary objective is to avoid any unnecessary tension, what I will call self-fulfilling news. What we all want, Europeans and Americans, is to show that we are paying close attention to the situation, but there must be no escalation in any way. What I am saying is that if the West, right, and now can I say, I think what Macron is saying here, I think this is a rebuke, a clear rebuke of the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, who at every opportunity to ease tensions and de-escalate the situation, on the contrary, goes and makes the situation worse. By way of illustration, there was that extraordinary comment that he made a few days ago at a press conference about Ukraine's NATO membership, where he said that Russia has no right to a veto, no right to a say, no right even apparently to an opinion on the issue. And following release of that Russian statement on Friday about the fact that NATO's commitment, NATO's promise to Ukraine and to Georgia must be cancelled, Stoltenberg again came out and said that this promise remains extant and the Russians have no right to demand that it be cancelled. I think that Macron at least understands that this is something that would be incredibly unwise, that it is incredibly unwise at this very tense time to talk in this way. Of course, Stoltenberg is not alone in these views. I understand that some of the East European countries, there's reports that one East European country in particular, I'm guessing it is Poland, is already speaking behind the scenes about its anger and disappointment about the conciliatory position taken by Biden, as it sees it, the overly conciliatory position taken by Biden towards Putin at the recent summit meeting, the recent virtual summit meeting, and at Biden's agreement to discuss these security issues with the Russians, to actually talk about these Russian red lines with the Russians. And in fact, the Daily Telegraph, from which I report these comments of Macron, goes on to say that Macron's comments will raise fears of a possible split between the US and its European allies over how to handle Moscow, something that Kiev has warned will only embolden President Putin. And I would add that Scholz, German Chancellor Scholz, who was also present at this news conference alongside Macron, though he was more measured in his words, seemed, in my opinion, to be essentially siding with him against the hardliners, and also clearly wanting to see some sort of resolution of this matter, which at least attempts to take into account Russian concerns. And we've seen that the United States has indeed acted in some form to address, or at least to show, that they are open to talking about these matters with the Russians. There's been news that the United States has put on hold a delivery of $200 million of weapons to Ukraine. These were apparently Mi-17 Russian-built helicopters, which had originally been intended for the Afghan government, which fell back in August, and which were to be sent to Ukraine. That particular arms delivery has apparently been put on hold. Last time, by the way, the US put a hold on a US arms delivery to Ukraine. It resulted in the impeachment of the president, an impeachment attempt which failed. But here we see that the United States, under a different administration and in a far more tense international environment, is doing the same again. And I understand that when Biden spoke to Zelenskyy over the phone on Thursday, he apparently told Zelenskyy that Ukraine cannot expect to join NATO for at least 10 years. And in fact, if one goes to the White House website and reads the extremely uninformative readout of the conversation between Biden and Zelenskyy, it's actually striking the extent to which that readout says virtually nothing about Ukraine and NATO, Ukrainian membership of NATO at all. It's very strange to see how this particular topic of Ukraine's NATO membership apparently wasn't actually discussed, or so this readout would have one think, between the US and Ukrainian presidents at all. Of course, one shouldn't take that entirely seriously, but that is essentially what the readout appears to say. Anyway, we see how the United States is trying, to the extent that it can, to try to find some way out of this situation, this crisis it has created for itself as it has pushed NATO eastward. It's begun to dawn, I think, on many people in the United States, at least in the US government, that this eastward expansion of NATO has now pushed up against Russia's red lines, and that the Russians are in a position to insist upon their red lines. The Russians have overwhelming military superiority in the area, which includes Ukraine. Nothing the United States can do can reverse that. The United States has excluded any possibility of coming to Ukraine's defense in the event that Ukraine finds itself in a war with Russia. The United States has talked about sanctions, imposing sanctions on Russia, but those sanctions would be extremely damaging to the Western economies and would probably be deeply unpopular with Western publics who might not understand or accept the reasons for them. So it's clear that the sanctions policy is probably not one that the United States and the Western powers really want to undertake. So logically, as I said already, they have to come to terms. But by leaving it to this point, to the point where we are now in this deep crisis, we see the extent to which the Russians have now hardened their position. It's going to be much more difficult and much more humiliating, if I say it frankly, for the Western powers to agree, to come to some agreement with Russia to stabilize the situation in Central and Eastern Europe than it might have been had they entered into these discussions 5-10 years or so ago. And it's clear that even on the question of the settlement of the internal conflict in Ukraine, the Western powers are still struggling to understand that the Russian position remains serious. Again, there's no hint of this in the White House readout of the conversation between Zelenskyy and Biden. Reports say that Biden told Zelenskyy that Ukraine must now press forward and grant autonomy to the breakaway regions of eastern Ukraine, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. However, he doesn't seem to have told Zelenskyy that Zelenskyy must negotiate with the leaders of those republics. The idea is apparently still to try to negotiate some sort of compromise directly with Russia, going over the heads of the leaders of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, with talk of a Normandy 4 meeting, in other words, a meeting between Ukraine and Russia, with Germany and France there in the background. In other words, direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine through that format to come to that sort of settlement. This despite the fact that the Russians have consistently and repeatedly ruled that idea out. So there is still some inability to put aside all the previous history of commitments, of brave talk, of talk about Russia not having any right to stop NATO expansion. There's been no talk about that, no serious talk even about settling the Ukrainian crisis in the format agreed in Minsk way back in 2015, which, to repeat again, requires direct negotiations between the internal Ukrainian parties, between the Ukrainian government and the leaders of the two republics, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. There is some understanding in the West that some kind of compromise with Russia is needed, but no willingness so far to come to that point where that compromise really addresses Russian concerns, even though the Russians are making it crystal clear that their position now is essentially non-negotiable. And one wonders increasingly where we're going from here. Maybe there is an element of bluff to some of these Russian statements. Maybe they might be prepared to compromise on some issues, on the margins. But I don't see them compromising on the negotiations for the internal settlement of Ukraine, of the conflict within Ukraine. I don't see them compromising on the question of NATO's eastward expansion, or of Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO. And I have to say, I'm not convinced that they're going to negotiate or compromise about anything. And given the build-up of Russian power, military power, which continues apace and which is steadily overhauling whatever military moves or counter deployments NATO makes or is thinking of making in Eastern Europe, it seems to me that those days when that Russian ultimatum will comes are drawing ever closer. Anyway, the fact remains, the summary of this video, if you like, is this. The Russians are in an uncompromising mood. They've set out in the strongest and most clear-cut way what they expect to see happen. They are now insisting that their demands are met, and they are insisting that those demands be met within a time frame which so far only they know. They're hinting, as I said, that an ultimatum must be, that an ultimatum is coming, and they've made it very clear that Ukraine and Georgia's membership of NATO are non-starters. Now, I've said already, I'm going to repeat again, since the Western powers are not prepared to fight for Ukraine, there is no sense in extending NATO membership to Ukraine. And in the light of that, the best thing to do is to accept that eastward expansion of NATO is no longer possible, and to negotiate with the Russians a treaty on that basis. Since that is the biggest sticking point, all the other things, the points that follow from it, are the points about military deployments, about the internal conflict within Ukraine itself. All of those, it seems to me, at that point fall into place. If there is no point or purpose in having Ukraine in NATO, there is no reason any longer, for example, to insist on a renegotiation of the Minsk agreement and to demand direct negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. The Ukrainian parties can be left to settle this conflict between themselves as the Minsk agreement requires them to. And if there is going to be a general stabilization of the situation in Europe, as there would be if eastward expansion of NATO was ended, well, there is no reason to keep all that NATO infrastructure, all those troops so close to Russia's borders anymore. The agreement in outline is there. It does not impinge on the United States' core interests or on the survival of the Western alliance. What it requires is a certain amount of statesmanship, of which we're now beginning to see glimmers, and a certain amount of realism, of which we're also starting to see glimmers, but of which so far there is no sign of any full acceptance. Well, we will see whether that acceptance comes. Now, I'm going to quickly finish this video by saying something about the internal situation in Ukraine, because I am tired of reading all these claims which are appearing in the Western media, always general, always generalized, always in the form of cliches, no actual reading of the actual facts, which appear to suggest that the reason this crisis has arisen is because the situation in Ukraine is strong, and because the situation in Ukraine is stable, and Ukraine is getting stronger by the day and by the hour, when the reality is the opposite. The first thing to say is that I've been informed, now this is in a private email, but by somebody who is very reliable and has his finger on the pulse of the situation in Ukraine itself, that President Zelensky's support in Ukraine has now fallen below the critical level of 20%. His favorability rating there has fallen below 20% and apparently continues to decline, as does that of his party, the Servant of the People Party, which apparently is in its early stages of disintegration. But I've also been given some information privately about what I understand is the IMF and World Bank assessments of the state of Ukraine and of Ukraine's economy. Now, I want to stress I haven't actually gone to the IMF and World Bank sites or sources directly. This is something that I've obtained through a third party, but I've no reason to doubt that this is roughly correct. And it says, the information I've had is that according to the IMF and the World Bank, Ukraine's GDP was $155 billion at the end of 2020, as compared with $183 billion in 2013, before the Maidan crisis. In other words, it's fallen by 15%. Apparently, also according to the IMF and the World Bank, industrial production has fallen by 25% as compared with 2013. Again, the figures relate to 2020, the end of 2020. And it's Ukraine's energy dependence on imported supplies of hydrocarbons and electricity has increased. I'm told that Ukraine's own natural gas production has decreased by 6.6% since 2013, with the decline continuing. And of course, Ukraine is buying coal and electricity from Russia, even though it claims to be at some sort of a war with Russia. And there's also been a decline in inward investment. In 2013, Ukraine received $5.6 billion of inward investment. In 2021, that fell to $800 million of inward investment. I should say that in 2013, by far the biggest investor, the country which made by far the biggest investments in Ukraine and in its economy, was Russia. And of course, that collapse in inward investment into Ukraine probably reflects the collapse of Russian investment into Ukraine, with Western investment obviously failing to fill the gap. Lastly, I understand that Ukrainian GDP per capita has fallen from $4,000 per year in 2013 to $3,725 in 2020, and that average purchasing power has decreased by 20% over the same period. Now, I would say that, of course, 2020 is the pandemic year, so it may be that these figures point an even bleaker picture than the real one, because, of course, as we all know, the pandemic, which hit Ukraine particularly hard, would have dampened economic activity. But it doesn't seem as if Ukraine is making any headway, has made any progress as compared to the position it had before the Maidan events of 2014. At best, its economy is still no better than it was in 2013, and quite possibly it has deteriorated. So there we are, a situation where both in political and in economic terms, the situation seems to be going backward in Ukraine. If other people have different or more accurate economic figures for Ukraine, they're welcome to set them out on the thread of this video, but I suspect that overall the figures I provided are accurate, and I understand from the third party who's provided them that they originate with the IMF and the World Bank. Well, thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel, and also on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Please also remember to check us out on Locals, where we have a thriving community which publishes its exclusive content, and where I myself publish exclusive content, and as does my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou, and where I now regularly do live streams every Wednesday. Please also join us on our other platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, Odyssey and SuperU. You'll find links under this video. You can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and also by coming to our shop and buying the many things that you will find there: our famous magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And I hope you've liked this video. If so, please remember to press the like button, and please also check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today, and have a wonderful day until we speak again.